Our top focus in WION right now, Russia's UN representative has said that with the Trump administration now in power in the US, there is a chance that the hot phase of Moscow's war against Ukraine could soon end. Outlining Moscow's conditions for a settlement, Vasily Nebenzia has claimed that a ceasefire and freezing hostilities alone would not resolve the conflict. The ambassador has said that Ukraine should be a demilitarized neutral state outside any alliances, warning that without security guarantees, Russia could launch another invasion.
The future of Ukraine needs to be a demilitarized neutral state, not a part of any blocs or alliances, for as has already been acknowledged by a US colleague, now specifically President Trump. It is indeed the prospect of the entry of Ukraine into NATO which triggered the crisis. And I think that this is now clear to all. And there are other important elements for the future agreement with Ukraine which do not directly pertain to Ukraine. And this is not something which we will dwell on today.
Nebenzia has also claimed that Ukraine has irrevocably lost Crimea, as well as Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia. Now, these are regions annexed by Russia. On the same day, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has dismissed the idea of making territorial concessions to Ukraine. The Kremlin has also previously said that any peace talks must be based on Ukrainian forces completely withdrawing from the annexed regions. The Kremlin also adds that European countries cannot be a part of any agreement to resolve the Ukraine crisis, accusing them of fueling the conflict in pursuit of their own geopolitical ambitions. Moscow's firm stance suggests that any future peace negotiations will be primarily influenced by the US and Russia, sidelining European nations. Well, as tensions grow between the US and NATO allies over Ukraine peace talks, David Pine, who is a former Pentagon officer, has revealed that the Trump administration may consider exiting NATO altogether. He has also suggested that Trump could withdraw US security guarantees for countries opposing his policies on the Russia-Ukraine war. Meanwhile, European officials believe that Trump is also likely to withdraw troops from the Baltics, leaving the continent vulnerable to Russia. As talks to end the war gain newfound momentum, the World Bank is set to release an updated assessment of damages in Ukraine on 25th of this month. And well, for more on this, we are now being joined by Dr. Malcolm Davis. He is a senior analyst in defense strategy and capability at Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He's joining us live from Canberra. Welcome to WION, Dr. Davis.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Davis, the question right now in everybody's mind is that as tensions grow between the US and NATO allies over Russia-Ukraine peace talks, a latest report by former Pentagon officer has said that Trump may be planning to exit NATO. Your assessment, do you think that this is perhaps a realistic threat?
I think it is a realistic threat. I think that Trump is determined to accommodate Putin's wishes at every opportunity without demanding anything in return from Putin. So I think that when you look back at the period immediately prior to the last invasion by Russia of Ukraine, the period of November 2021, Putin laid down a series of demands to the West, and these included the withdrawal of NATO from Eastern and Central Europe, the removal of any prospect for Ukraine joining NATO, and the removal of any security guarantees to Ukraine and the demilitarization of Ukraine. Every single one of those is now on the negotiating table. And given the way that Trump seems to be approaching this in what can only be described as a process of utter capitulation, I think it is quite possible that Putin will demand that certainly US forces and NATO forces withdraw from Central and Eastern Europe. And Trump may be incentivized then to simply withdraw from NATO altogether.
Right, Dr. Davis, I do want to talk about the ramifications, but of exiting NATO, that is, if US does exit NATO. But first up, like you also mentioned, the European nations and Kiev have clearly been sidelined over Ukraine peace talks. However, European officials have warned that a Ukraine peace deal without their participation will not work. So do you think that this threat of exiting NATO is a way by which Europe may not add any roadblocks in US-Russia peace talks?
Well, I think the Europeans are quite correct to say that it won't work. And I think that it's not intended to work, at least not from Putin's perspective. Putin sees a ceasefire as merely an opportunity for a pause to regroup and rearm in order to either launch the war against Ukraine in a year or so to take more territory or potentially to attack NATO directly. It's quite interesting that Russia is planning to deploy 150,000 troops into Belarus close to the Polish border in July. And I think that if you then see US forces withdraw from the Baltic states and from other potential states in Central and Eastern Europe, that would leave NATO highly exposed. So really what we're talking about here is not a ceasefire leading to peace. We're talking about a pause in the conflict leading to peace in our time. And we all know where that led in 1938. So I do think that we need to be very cautious about seeing anything positive in this situation. This situation is akin to a surrender by the United States to Putin's demands and sowing the seeds for the next war, which will be much more dangerous, much wider in geographical scope, with all the potential for escalation through the nuclear threshold.
Right, you did touch upon the ramifications if US exits NATO. My last question to you, do you think Europe is more worried about themselves than Ukraine altogether?
No, I think that Europe is worried about both. They're worried about their own security, and I think they are right to be, because Russia now poses a real threat to their security, a threat of imminent attack. And they're also worried about Ukraine because they understand that if Russia wins in Ukraine because we essentially cede Ukraine to them as Putin demands, then it just reinforces the prospect of that wider war. So if you do have the US withdraw from NATO, that achieves one of Putin's big aims. It incentivizes him to push for more and grab more territory. And if you then have basically submission and capitulation in Ukraine, it guarantees almost that Russia will make a move against NATO within the next year or two. So I do think the Europeans are very right to be very concerned about their own security at this point.
Right. Thanks very much, Dr. Davis, for joining us on WION and sharing insights with us on this story.
Thank you.